Hi, boys and girls. I wanted to go over this reading from Wednesday, April 22nd with you because I thought it was kind of challenging. So we're going to read this together and I'm going to stop and make annotations. And if you haven't done this one yet, why don't you do this with me now? The story is called Balboa. The Spanish colonists on the island of Hispaniola made frequent visits to the mainland, searching for the rich cities of which Marco Polo had written. Word reached the colonists that some of these gold hunters were starving at a place called Darien, and a ship was immediately sent to their relief. The cargo of the ship consisted of barrels of provisions and ammunition. So, what we know so far, based on paragraphs 1 and 2, is that we have some Spanish colonists searching for gold. And it was gold in rich cities that Marco Polo had once written about. Let's take a look at paragraph 3. Imagine, if you can, the amazement of the commander of the expedition when, after his ships were under sail, a young and handsome man stepped out of one of the barrels. The young man was Vasco Nunez Balboa. He had chosen this way to escape from Cuba, where he owed large sums of money which he could not pay. The commander was angry and threatened to leave Balboa on a desert island, but at length he took pity on the young man and allowed him to remain on board the ship. So based on paragraph 3, we were introduced to Vasco Nunez Balboa. That's who the story is titled after, okay? So it says Balboa came to escaped from Cuba because he owed people a lot of money, which he couldn't pay. And he basically hid himself into a barrel. And when they were boarding the ship, after they had taken sail, they were on sea, out pops Balboa. So there's my annotation so far. And I'm going to put down paragraph, remember that's our paragraph sign, 1 through 3. If you have your rally book, you can write right in the margin. Those are your books to keep. If not, you can just write on a scrap sheet of paper, or if you have Post-it notes at home, you can do this as well. Just so we think about our story. We're using our active reading strategies and annotating while we are reading. So I'm going to set this aside over here. Let's scroll down now to paragraph 4. When the mainland was reached, the Spaniards who were already there, having heard of the cruelty of the commander, refused to let him land. He therefore put off to sea and was never heard of again. Balboa then took command of the men and began immediately to explore the country. So in paragraph 4, we learn that the original commander wasn't allowed. They had heard, the Spaniards who were there heard, oh, this man's not a good guy. We don't want him here. He gets upset, he leaves, and Balboa ends up taking over, okay? So Balboa becomes the commander. My paragraph number 4 annotation. Balboa becomes commander and begins exploring. Remember, they were looking for riches. So things like gold, maybe, okay, that Marco Polo had written about. So that's what they're exploring these different countries for. Paragraph 5. He made a friendly alliance with an Indian chief who presented him with gold and slaves. The Spaniards were delighted at the sight of so much riches. They began to melt and weigh the gold, and at last he fell to quarreling desperately about the division of it. This the Indians could not understand. Okay, so they couldn't understand why the men were quarreling or arguing, okay, fighting over how they were going to divide up the gold. The Indians could not understand. They knew nothing of money and valued the metal only because it could be made into beautiful ornaments. So the gold doesn't mean anything to the native Indians of this island. I'm going to write that down. It might come in handy later. Hint, hint. So for paragraphs 5 through 6, here's my annotation. Balboa's crew argues over how to divide up the gold. The Indians can't understand this because, excuse me, to them, gold is just a pretty metal. They don't have any desire to collect the gold like Balboa's crew does. It doesn't mean the same thing to them. Okay, so now we're on paragraph 7. An Indian boy who had heard the dispute told the Spaniards that if they cared so much about that yellow stuff, it would be wise for them to go to a country where there was enough of it for all. The Spaniards eagerly questioned him regarding this place. The boy then described a country across the mountains and to the south, on the shores of a great sea, where the metal was so plentiful that the natives used it for their ordinary drinking cups and bowls. Okay, so an Indian boy in paragraph 7 is telling them, if you guys really like this stuff so much, you got to go to this other country across the mountains and south. Balboa immediately started southward across the mountains in search of this rich country. On his way, he came upon a tribe of hostile Indians who attacked him, but who fled in alarm from the guns of the Spaniards. My annotation for paragraph 7 and 8 is going to be about the boy tells the crew to go to a different place where gold is plentiful. That means there's a lot of it. And remember, you have to keep in mind that the Indians are giving Balboa's men all of this information because the gold does not mean money to them. It's just a type of metal that they use. Okay, now we're on paragraph 9. Taking some Indians as guides, Balboa pushed on through the mountains, and on September 25th, 1513, from one of the highest peaks, looked down upon the Pacific Ocean. With his Spaniards, he descended the mountain and in 4 days reached the shore of that magnificent body of water. Balboa waded out into it with his sword in his hand and formally took possession of it for the king of Spain. He called it the South Sea because he was looking toward the south when he first saw it, and the Pacific Ocean was known by this name for many years. So in paragraphs 9 and 10, Balboa claims the South Sea, aka also known as Pacific Ocean, for Spain. Okay, paragraph 11. On the shore, he met an Indian who repeated to him the same story that the Indian boy had told him about the rich country on the border of this sea and farther to the south. Balboa then made up his mind to find this country. Accordingly, he returned to Darien and sent word to the Spanish king of his great discovery of the South Sea. He then began to take his ships apart and send them piece by piece across the mountains to the Pacific coast. Boys and girls, these are huge, giant wooden ships. So he's having them taken apart and carried over the mountains to get to the Pacific coast. This was an enormous undertaking. The journey was a very difficult one, and hundreds of poor Indians who carried the burdens dropped dead from exhaustion. Okay. Our annotation for paragraphs 13 and 14 is that Balboa decides to take apart ships and have them carried, have the pieces carried to Pacific coast. So you have to try to imagine in your mind what it would be like to take apart these huge wooden ships, enormous, into big pieces and have them carried over through the mountains without the machinery or technologies that we have today. This would be awful. Let's start off on paragraph 15. That's where we left off. At length, after long months of labor, 4 ships were thus carried across the mountains and rebuilt on the Pacific coast. These were the first European vessels ever launched on the Great South Sea. 300 men were in readiness to go with Balboa on his voyage and in search of the rich country of the south. The little iron and a little pitch were still needed for the ships, and Balboa delayed his departure in order to get these articles. The delay gave his enemies, who were jealous because of his success, time to carry out a plot against him. They accused him of plotting to set up an independent government of his own and caused him to be arrested for treason. In less than 24 hours, this brave and high-spirited leader was tried, found guilty, and beheaded. So ended all his ambitious plans. So Balboa was trying to get a couple of items, or materials, I should say, for the ships before they start their voyage. In the meantime, his enemies, who were jealous, decided to plot a plan against him. It gave them time because Balboa was delayed. And they basically accused him of treason. And in less than 24 hours, they had tried him, meaning taken him before their form of court or judge. and he was found guilty and beheaded. And that was the end of Balboa. I want to point out this word right here, that he was arrested for treason. The word treason it means to go against your country. So we have our vocab word, treason, which means to go against or betray your country and try to overthrow its government. So that's what he was accused of and then beheaded. That's how the punishments were back in the 1500s. And this particular lesson ends with Balboa, an illustration of Balboa. You can kind of see his sword here. He's standing what we believe to be on perhaps the Pacific Sea. And you're going to have a question that asks about what this image conveys to the reader. The last thing I want to point out to you for today is the very last question that asks, it's not multiple choice. You have to actually answer the question. So you're going to want to remember to turn the question around. I'm seeing a lot of students not using capital letters and proper punctuation. Just because we're typing does not mean that we're not doing that. So the question says, the article describes how Balboa moved the ships to the South Sea by having them taken apart and carried across the mountains. Describe a feature that could be added to the article to emphasize how great an undertaking this was. Explain why you chose that feature and how it would emphasize the enormity of the task. Boys and girls, I came up with some possibilities for us. In case you need a clue, you could say, after turning the question around and answering incomplete sentences, one thing that could be added would be descriptive writing to show how difficult it was. Remember, this is writing that appeals to our five senses. So that it would make the reader really feel like he or she was experiencing carrying all those heavy pieces over the mountains. Or maybe an illustration, or perhaps some dialogue, okay? Those are three different ideas that I came up with. If you have something different, that's fine, but you need to make sure that you answer incomplete sentences to that last question, and also explain. A lot of us are forgetting this second part of the question. We're describing a feature, and then explain why you chose that feature and how it would emphasize the enormity of the task. So if you're adding an illustration, for example, you could talk about how adding the illustration would show the reader maybe beads of sweat, or the text described Indians dropping dead from exhaustion. You could talk about the dialogue maybe between the people carrying it if you were using that. What would they have said to each other? Descriptive writing. What are we seeing, smelling, hearing, feeling? Okay, you have to make sure you explain in order to get full credit. Okay, I hope this helps with today's task. Please feel free to comment if you need some more help.